John Richter came to Los Alamos in mid-1958 with his PhD from the University of Texas. We don't hold that against him. He came to work in Group W4, which was then one of the fission weapon design groups, and worked on code development, lethality, vulnerability, and effects of nuclear weapons. But his real forte was fission weapon design. And during his tenure here at the laboratory, he participated in over 40 underground nuclear weapon tests. Made significant contributions and became the group leader of the fission weapon design group, and later a program manager for weaponization. That's when I met John. I came to the lab in 1975, and John mentored a lot of students in his day, and I was one of the very lucky people that was there and was mentored by John. He participated in a 1995 Jason study. As many of you may know, the Jason study was sort of one of the pre-dating studies that led into the comprehensive test ban. Okay. And then John took a change of station in Washington, where he worked for the DOE's Office of Energy Intelligence and Weapons Intelligence, and returned in 1997 and retired and became a lab associate for 6 years, and consulted with the Fission Weapon Design Group. His total association with the weapons program been over 45 years, and he's almost a legend in the weapons community. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. John Richter.
This will do just fine. Okay. Can you move this thing? Because I need to. I don't need it, right? That's right. I don't need it, but I. Okay, good. That's good. The title of my talk is The Los Alamos and the U.S. Nuclear Weapon Program During and After the Cold War. There are excellent books about the Manhattan Project during those epic days at Los Alamos and elsewhere. Since nuclear fission was identified in Germany, the watchwords were "beat the Nazis to the bomb." After World War II, militant communism took over much of the world, and those nations challenged the U.S. The watchwords became "deter communism with nuclear weapons." With the accession of Mikhail Gorbachev in 1985 as head of the Soviet Union, the Cold War was winding down, and also regard for nuclear weapons. A little of what happened with nuclear weapon program in Los Alamos during the Cold War is described. This is an unauthorized reminiscence, namely it's me. The 1930s were a time of great scientific enlightenment as the great minds unraveled the secrets of the atom. It was also a time of great social disenlightenment due to Hitler, Mussolini, Stalin, and the Japanese warlords. Many scientists fled to Britain or the U.S. From the affected lands. For example, in 1938, Enrico Fermi collected his Nobel Prize, and he and his family fled to the U.S. because his wife Laura was Jewish. Induced fission of uranium-235 indicated a great new energy source. In the effort to beat the Nazis to the atomic bomb, Colonel Leslie R. Groves of the Army Corps of Engineers was promoted to Brigadier General and put in charge of the project. He called it the Manhattan Engineering District of the Army Corps of Engineers. There can be no doubt that without Groves' single-minded drive, the project might have bogged down. 8 Nobel laureates, or future ones, worked on the Manhattan Project. Uranium-235 and plutonium-239 are candidate weapon fuels. General Groves opted for both. In order to make a large yield, they must be as pure as possible. Uranium-235 is primordial and occurs as 0.7% of natural uranium. The rest is uranium-238, from which the 235 must be separated. Plutonium-239 is a man-made nuclide that had been recently synthesized by Glenn Seaborg and his team at Berkeley, using neutrons from Ernest Lawrence's cyclotron. There was no weapon-grade uranium, that is, with 235 greater than 90%. Enrichment machines had to be invented, built, and used. Only microgram quantities of plutonium were available. Nuclear reactors were necessary to make it in quantity. General Groves chose Los Alamos in New Mexico as the site of the Weapon Development Lab. He named J. Robert Oppenheimer to lead it. Scientists began arriving in March 1943. General Groves selected Oak Ridge, Tennessee as the site of the uranium enrichment plants and also the X-10 reactor for pilot plutonium production while Hanford, Washington facility was being built. Uranium separation used a great deal of electric power. Oak Ridge is in the Tennessee Valley Authority area. Oak Ridge enriched uranium with 3 tandem processes: the S50 thermal diffusion, the early K25 gaseous diffusion, and finally the Y12 electromagnetic method. There was barely enough material for the one bomb used at Hiroshima. The heat-generating plutonium production reactors were located at Hanford, Washington, in central Washington state, and used the Columbia River as a heat dump. Hanford production began in early 1944, and plenty of material was shipped to Los Alamos by war's end. In addition, there was a unit of the Army Air Corps under Colonel Paul Tibbets, who organized and trained a bomb group to drop the weapons. The chosen weapon concept was gun assembly. The nuclear material was divided into 2 pieces. Each was subcritical. One piece was driven to the other by propellant. When they came together, they were supercritical and exploded. Propellant was used because the assembly pressure needed to be less than the material's tensile strength. A gun assembly was slow for a reasonable length assembly cannon. The uranium weapon called Little Boy was used at Hiroshima. The plutonium gun assembled concept was named Thin Man. Los Alamos was also considering high explosive assembly for faster assembly than with propellant. Since high explosive assembly pressure is much higher than the tensile strength of any material, new technology had to be developed. In the summer of 1944, the first gram samples of reactor-produced plutonium arrived from Oak Ridge X-10 reactor. The neutron background was much higher than the accelerator-produced material from Berkeley. Thin Man was not feasible. As the slow-moving gun assemble system achieved critical, the high neutron background from plutonium could initiate the divergent chain reaction before full assembly and low yield would result. In contrast, the uranium in Little Boy had so few background neutrons that there was high probability that full assembly and full yield would result. Fat Man, the high explosive assembled implosion device, became the baseline plutonium concept, replacing Thin Man. The device was also called the Christie Gadget for Robert Christie, who worked out the design. In just 1 year, Fat Man was proved at Trinity and on target at Nagasaki. Trinity using the Fat Man device was the first nuclear test on 16 July 1945. It was conducted about 50 miles southeast of Socorro, New Mexico, on what became the Army White Sands Missile Range. The yield was 20 kilotons. A kiloton is roughly 1,000,000 kilowatt hours of energy. The Hiroshima, Japan nuclear attack took place on 6 August 1945. The weapon was fired in anger without a prior test. The gun-assembled Little Boy was fueled with enriched uranium called oralloy for Oak Ridge alloy. The weapon weighed 9,200 pounds and taxed the B-29 bomber Enola Gay to carry it. En route to Japan, Navy Captain William Parsons, the weaponeer, crawled into the bomb bay and armed the device. He loaded the propellant, closed the assembly cannon breech, and turned on the enable switches. The device developed about 14 kilotons. However, if Enola Gay had crashed with a weapon on board, armed or not, it could have developed full yield. Little Boy was a gun assemble device, and the assembly cannon bore was unobstructed. 3 days later, the B-29 boxcar dropped Fat Man, similar to the Trinity device on Nagasaki, Japan. The yield was about 20 kilotons. 6 days later, Japan accepted unconditional surrender. The Fat Man weapon weighed 10,800 pounds, and Boxcar had to refuel at Okinawa to make it back to Tinian. Again, had Boxcar crashed with a weapon on board, it could have developed yield, although not as much as was possible with Little Boy. There is still a raging debate whether the 2 atomic bombs should have been used on real Japanese targets, or whether there should have been announced demonstration explosions to convince them of the futility of further resistance. Allied forces had recently completed the excessively bloody capture of Okinawa, which is Japan's 47th prefecture. The next campaign was Operation Olympic, the invasion of the other 46 prefectures. The Okinawa assault was met with kamikazes from the air, banzai charges on the ground, and civilians leaping to their deaths to avoid the rape and pillage of American soldiers. Okinawa cost 50,000 U.S. casualties, including 12,000 dead, and about 200,000 Japanese died, about equal between civilian and military. This exceeded the toll of both Hiroshima and Nagasaki. My guess is that the nuclear attacks on real targets were ordered in hope that killing a large number of Japanese with atomic bombs would shock them into surrendering and obviate Olympic. Post-war Japanese sources suggest that acceptance of surrender was a close call and Japan might have fought on. On several occasions, I have been thanked by World War II veterans for the bombs used on Japan. Each said which Operation Olympic wave he was slated for. Each believed that he would not have survived the assault and the bombs saved his life. I was a schoolboy during the Manhattan days and had nothing to do with those bombs. They knew that. They just wanted to thank someone, anyone, connected with the atomic bomb development that they believed had saved their lives. Norris Bradbury took over as Los Alamos lab director when Oppenheimer left in late 1945. The laboratory organization became director, deputy director, associate director for weapons, and associate director for research, and about 12 technical division leaders. The lab was run by about 16 people. Between 16 July 1945 and 23 September 1992, the U.S. conducted more than 1,000 nuclear detonations. Most of the work is classified, but some glimpses can be described. The worldwide risk of all those nuclear explosions cannot be understood without considering the threat of the Cold War. The world was full of hunger and hope at the close of World War II. Armies demobilized and troops went home to rebuild their lives, except the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. There was increasing animosity between USSR and USA. In 1945, the Soviets blockaded land access to the divided city of Berlin. The U.S. countered with the year-long airlift that brought in supplies, including coal fuel, hauled it in by air. In 1949, communists took over mainland China. In mid-1950, communist North Korea invaded South Korea. Later that year, communist China entered the war. In 1953, the Korean War ended at Panmunjom with an uneasy peace. There was no victory, and nuclear weapons had not been used. In 1959, a communist regime took over Cuba, which was followed in 1962 with a missile crisis. There was consideration of nuclear weapon use, but they were not used. Later, the simmering conflict in Vietnam flared into a full-scale war that lasted a decade. Communist North Vietnam fought the South, which was supported by the U.S. In 1973, the U.S. pulled out of Vietnam, leaving the Communists with victory, but nuclear weapons had not been used. The Soviet Union developed a modern nuclear stockpile and conducted, by its own admission, 969 nuclear detonations between August 1949 and September 1990. It operated at least 2 nuclear test sites, one at Novaya Zemlya, an island in the far north, and at Semipalatinsk in Kazakhstan. In addition, the Soviets maintained a large army, developed formidable air and missile forces, and created a large navy. The U.S. faced a significant threat. Before the nuclear strikes on Japan, enemy intransigence caused General Groves to order 2 more Fat Man weapons for delivery in November 1945, but the war had ended by then. The devices were fired as nuclear weapons effects tests in the summer of 1946 at Bikini Atoll in the Pacific Ocean Marshall Islands as the Operation Crossroads Able and Baker events. Able was an airdrop over an array of ships. Baker was an underwater burst. The Atomic Energy Act of 1946 defined the nuclear program. The law established a national monopoly on everything related to nuclear energy release. The Act also established restricted data as a category of classified information regarding nuclear technology, with penalties for wrongful disclosure. President Eisenhower established the Atoms for Peace Initiative, which declassified a great deal of nuclear data, and by presidential order, he prohibited the production of weapon materials in civilian reactors. Later, President Carter, also by presidential order, prohibited the reprocessing of civilian nuclear reactor fuel. That one's got to go. It's got to go. Operation Sandstone in May-June 1948 was the first post-war nuclear weapon development test series at Eniwetok in the Pacific Ocean Marshall Islands. Each of the 3 tests could be described as a Fat Man incorporating significant internal changes that advanced implosion technology. In 1947, before Sandstone, the U.S. recognized that it could not forever maintain its nuclear weapon monopoly. The U.S. developed a worldwide detection system to determine whether someone had conducted a nuclear test. Optical, seismic, acoustic, and atmospheric effects were monitored to determine whether a large explosion had taken place and to estimate its yield. Atmospheric radioactive debris, fallout, was collected. If it contained actinides, uranium, neptunium, plutonium, etc., together with fission products, then those would indicate that fission debris had entered the atmosphere. Later, the N2N reaction products, such as plutonium-238, were observed. The reaction is a fast neutron in and 2 out. It indicates a very fast neutron, such as those from thermonuclear processes. Beryllium-7 with a 53-day half-life indicated that lithium, H-bomb fuel, was used. The detection system was used on our 1948 Operation Sandstone, but in August 1949 there were indications that the Soviets had tested. We knew about Joe 1 before Stalin informed us. Joe-X is the U.S. designator of a Soviet test. The X is the U.S. serial number. Meanwhile, Los Alamos people petitioned Santa Fe for a political status rather than government reservation. Santa Fe ignored the repeated requests. Los Alamos people even petitioned the state of Texas, which recommended that they continue to work on Santa Fe. Finally, in 1949, Santa Fe took little pieces from Sandoval and Santa Fe counties and created Los Alamos County, the 32nd in New Mexico. The state includes about 120,000 square miles, and 1/32 of that would be nearly 4,000 square miles. Los Alamos County actually includes 110 square miles. But at last there was a place called Los Alamos. Now we move into the first half of the 1950s. At that time, circa 1950, the nuclear weapon program included Hanford, which made plutonium, Oak Ridge made oralloy, and Los Alamos did almost everything else, plus the recently established Mound Laboratories near Dayton, Ohio. After the Soviet test, the U.S. nuclear program went into high gear and the nuclear arms race was on. In early 1950, President Truman ordered a speed-up of the H-bomb development. Also around 1950, the following spin-offs happened. Spin-offs from Los Alamos included Sandia and Albuquerque, Rocky Flats near Denver, Pantex near Amarillo, Oak Ridge Y-12, and the Lawrence Livermore Lab in the California Bay Area. Sandia Labs did warhead integration. Rocky Flats fabricated plutonium. Pantex made the explosive components and did final weapon assembly. Oak Ridge Y-12 became a uranium metal factory, and Livermore Lab was a design lab with capabilities similar to Los Alamos. The Oak Ridge K-25 gaseous diffusion uranium enrichment plant was working well, and the U.S. built 2 more such plants, one at Paducah, Kentucky, and the other at Portsmouth, Ohio. It was believed that tritium, radioactive hydrogen-3, was necessary for the H-bomb. Hanford reactors could not readily make tritium, therefore the Savannah River site was built in South Carolina to make tritium as well as more plutonium. The Nevada Test Site, NTS, was established for more rapid progress in nuclear weapon development. The first test, Ranger Able, was fired in January 1951. Many early NTS tests were staged from Kirtland Air Force Base in Albuquerque and airdropped at NTS. Other plants were Bendix at Kansas City, Missouri, and General Electric Neutron Devices at Pinellas, Florida, which made weapon components developed by Sandia Labs. These were called GOCOs, for government-owned and contractor-operated, and included upward of 100,000 employees during the Cold War. After Klaus Fuchs, the atom spy, delivered Fat Man plans to the Soviets, Lavrenti Beria, KGB head, insisted that the Soviets shoot Fat Man as Joe 1. U.S. missile experts decided to wait for a smaller warhead than Fat Man before they built a rocket to carry it. But the Soviets built a rocket to carry Joe 1/Fat Man. This was the technology that got Sputnik, the world's first man-made satellite, into Earth orbit in 1957 before the U.S. It is interesting to speculate on what the world's space programs would have been like had there not been the military urgency of nuclear weapon-armed missiles. U.S. weapons of the early post-war era were adaptations of Little Boy and Fat Man. In each case, the nuclear material was kept outside the system for safety. It was installed when needed. The HE system did not contain any nuclear material and was in the custody of the armed service. The nuclear capsule contained all the nuclear attributes of the weapon and was in the custody of a civilian weaponeer as prescribed by the Atomic Energy Act of 1946. Of course, nuclear yield was impossible unless the capsule was installed in the HE system. The HE systems in those days were large and awkward to load and unload. Therefore, aircraft often flew with them on board, but without the capsule and the weaponeer. Accidents that damage nuclear weapons are called broken arrows. However, if the capsule was not installed, then there was no large concern. As an example, in 1957, a B-36 bomber was on landing approach from the south into Kirtland Air Force Base at Albuquerque. The bomb accidentally released, fell through the bomb bay door. The HE exploded on unoccupied ground and blasted a large crater. The only casualties were the airmen's careers. The high-yield Operation Greenhouse was conducted in April-May 1951 at Eniwetok in the Pacific. There were 4 tests. 2 were high-yield extensions of implosion technology. Another was George, the first thermonuclear test explosion, and Item was the first test of the deuterium-tritium boosting principle. Both were steps toward the H-bomb. A strong contingent from Britain participated in the Manhattan Project. One was Klaus Fuchs, a German who immigrated to Britain. He was a key contributor to Fat Man development. He gave the Soviets complete particulars of Fat Man. He was caught in Britain in 1950, sentenced to 14 years in prison. He served 9 and then went behind the Iron Curtain. The Fuchs case temporarily ended nuclear weapon collaboration between the U.S. and Britain, which fired its own first test in 1952. In 1953, the U.S. executed Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, husband and wife, for nuclear espionage for the Soviets. Nothing those two did was on a par with the information lost due to Fuchs. Hints still turn up that Soviet nuclear spying continued well after Fuchs and the Rosenbergs. The H-bomb is a lead-lined coffin that contains the nuclear primary and secondary stages. The primary is a fission device which, if removed from the system, would operate the same. The H-bomb secondary stage is designed to operate from the primary thermal radiation, which has a much higher energy density than high explosive. The primary radiates electromagnetic energy similar to an incandescent lamp, but the primary is so hot that the thermal radiation is at X-ray wavelengths rather than visible. The lead liner reduces X-ray loss. The secondary contains fissile material and lithium-6 deuteride thermonuclear fuel. The secondary is capable of megatons of yield. A megaton is 1,000 kilotons. Excuse me a minute. Warm evening. Thank you. Okay. The key thermonuclear reaction is DT. A deuteron, hydrogen nucleus with mass 2, collides with a triton and produces an energetic neutron and a helium-4. Deuterium is stable and can be separated from natural hydrogen. The triton is radioactive hydrogen-3 with a 12.3-year half-life. Thermonuclear neutrons have a great effect on weapon performance, and helium-4 is a residue from the reaction. Because of the short tritium half-life, the DT reaction must be preceded within a few years with tritium production. Natural lithium-6 is bombarded with neutrons and produces tritons and helium-4s. The usual source of neutrons is a nuclear reactor. The energy-rich H-bomb can affect both tritium production and DT fusion reactions simultaneously at the target by using fuel in the form of the chemical compound lithium-6 deuteride. Both lithium-6 and deuterium are stable and can be enriched from natural materials. Lithium-6 deuteride fuel is not radioactive and is very inexpensive. It can be considered H-bomb fuel. On the other hand, the less energetic boosted fission primary stage is supplied with radioactive tritium that was produced in a reactor. In order to have a ready stockpile with weapons that can be used at any time, tritium must be continuously produced so that each weapon's tritium can be replenished on a fixed schedule. Operation Ivy was conducted at Eniwetok in the Pacific in November 1952, 2 months after the Livermore Lab was established. Ivy Mike was the world's first H-bomb. It developed over 10 megatons. The secondary thermonuclear fuel was cryogenic liquid deuterium, wet fuel. The device was so large and heavy that it was not deployable. It was built in place on a coral islet. After the test, there was a 200-foot deep where the island had been. The H-bomb principle had been proved. King, the other Ivy test, was a large yield fission-only device. It was a hedge in case Mike didn't work. In August 1953, the Soviets fired Joe-4. The yield was high, and worse, the fallout contained beryllium-7, the indicator for lithium in the thermonuclear fuel. Did they have a deployable H-bomb? The answer was no, but we did not know it then. Operation Castle was launched in March 1954 at Eniwetok in the Pacific with the determination that we would bring home a deployable H-bomb concept, one that used lithium-6 deuteride, the dry H-bomb fuel. Castle Bravo produced 15 megatons, the largest yield of any U.S. test. Romeo did a commendable 11 megatons. Union and Kuhn, third and fourth Castle tests, were different approaches to the H-bomb, but the previous two had worked better. All four devices contained a material that was thought necessary, but would be a significant operational nuisance. Yankee, the next test, used the Romeo configuration, but redesigned without the unfortunate material. It was to see what the yield loss would be. Yankee yield exceeded that of Romeo, and the modern thermonuclear stage was born. The last Castle test, Castle Nectar, was much smaller than the others and was of the Yankee genre. It worked very well indeed. The Castle results can be described as sensational. Radiant energy transfer was a key issue for the H-bomb. Before computers, it was not possible to calculate radiation flow with a moving boundary. It was decided to make the devices so massive that boundaries simply would not move during the time of concern. American car and foundry industries was engaged to build the H-bombs. It took a rail car manufacturer to have the machinery and know-how to fabricate the massive steel components that were required. Only the giant B-36 and B-52 bombers could carry the early H-bombs. Now we'll move into the latter half of the 1950s. AEC built Los Alamos Tech Area 3 on the south side of Los Alamos Canyon together with the bridge. The move to TA3 began in 1955, and the old TA1 buildings in downtown Los Alamos were torn down. The raising took years to complete because when there was a plutonium spill, the area was cleaned up as best as possible and then painted or paved over. The stopgap protection was adequate until the structure was torn down, when the debris had to be carefully disposed of. In 1957, the town was open to the public. Shortly after Castle, NTS Operation Teapot happened in 1955, in which two breakthroughs occurred. One was the hollow DT-boosted fission device, which was instantly recognized as the best approach to the H-bomb primary. It is an ancestor of primaries in the U.S. enduring stockpile. Operation Castle produced the high-yield H-bomb secondary stage, and Teapot the primary to go with it. The other Teapot breakthrough was initiated by Livermore, but its description is still classified and took some years to come to fruition. In November 1955, the Soviets conducted two large-yield tests, Joe 18 and Joe 19. Later, it was found out that Joe 18 was a follow-on to Joe 4 and a dead end. Joe 19 was the first radiation-driven H-bomb. The close time proximity to 1954 Operation Castle suggested espionage. The Castle secondary and the Teapot primary concepts happened only a few months apart. A third breakthrough was the 1954 amendment to the Atomic Energy Act, which, among other things, allowed military personnel custody of nuclear material. They wanted weapons to be all up and ready to shoot, which necessitated one-point safety. These are design features that preclude nuclear yield in case of an accident. A fourth breakthrough was the 1955 delivery of the first IBM Model 704 supercomputer. My definition of a supercomputer is the mean time between failures generally exceeds the problem runtime. The 704s used vacuum tubes, which required huge amounts of air conditioning for cooling. Its clock speed was 80 kilohertz, 80,000 cycles per second. Ooh. When I hired into Los Alamos in mid-1958, that was 50 years ago, I had a brand new security badge and was given a secret document to read, the first I had ever seen. The first page inside was the admonition. The enemy wants this information. The next page inside was the title page. Author Klaus Fuchs. The four great breakthroughs were known by the spring of 1955. President Eisenhower and Chairman Khrushchev agreed to a nuclear test moratorium to happen in the fall of 1958. The agreement was between heads of state and could be voided by either side with 30 days' notice. The moratorium began 31 October 58 and ended 1 September 61, after notification from the Soviets. The moratorium necessitated NTS Operation Hardtack II in the fall of 1958. It was felt that that would be the last chance in the foreseeable future to prove both the performance and one-point safety of several primaries due to interstockpile. 37 tests were fired in 49 days, ending with a moratorium 31 October. The device would be released on, say, Monday. It was built on Tuesday, run up on a balloon, and fired on Wednesday. Hardtack II results are best summed up with the ballad. Here's to our Operation Hardtack, the phase in the early fall when the safety tests went nuclear and the nuclear tests went small. The author of those immortal words is unknown. When testing ended with the moratorium, there was near despair. The way to make a nuclear device one-point safe was to modify the design so that it would not develop nuclear yield from accidental HE detonation. When the system was made safe, then would it work? Livermore had a system that was slated to enter stockpile in 3 weapons. It was thought to be one-point safe, but it was one-point detonated in a different mode and found to be unsafe. This stopped the deployments until a fix could be found years later. Los Alamos had a system that was to be used in 4 weapons and was frustratingly difficult to make safe. Someone recalled that a very lean version of it had been fired as a marginality test. It worked very well. It was not marginal at all, and it was found to be one-point safe and filled the need. Nuclear weapon build rates in the late 50s and early 60s were the highest ever. This was due to the enlarged manufacturing, and nuclear material production had proceeded well. There were new technology weapons carried on fighter bombers, fired from artillery, long-range missiles, some of which could be launched from submarines. The American people really believed that nuclear weapons would save them from the communist hordes. Each weapon type was given a mark number. Little Boy was Mark I. Fat Man was Mark III. Mark II was Thin Man, the plutonium gun assemble concept that was abandoned. Later, the BXX and WXX designations came into use. The XX is still the mark number, the B indicates a bomb, and W was a warhead that was carried on a DOD vehicle. By the close of the 50s, the mark numbers were in the 40s. During the 1958-61 moratorium, Los Alamos opted for an experimental effort to understand one-point safety because calculations were unreliable at that time. Los Alamos requested permission to conduct a series of zero-yield safety tests during the moratorium. Permission was granted, provided that the tests were conducted on-site at Los Alamos. That had to be President Eisenhower. He really hated the nuclear program. But Operation Hood was under great secrecy because this was the time of the Francis Powers U-2 spy plane loss over Russia, and there was fear of further embarrassing our government. When the 1987 unclassified report, LA 10902, described the Hood effort, an indignant outburst from the Russians was expected. There was none. They had known about it. The Hood tests were fired underground under about 70 feet of earth at TA-49, 5 miles upwind from White Rock, a major residential area. A one-point implosion is already degraded, but by how much we did not know. The devices were further degraded by deleting plutonium. A series of creep-up shots were fired with incrementally added plutonium to determine the plutonium mass for one-point safety. 35 hydronuclear tests were fired. The largest nuclear energy release was 0.4 pounds on top of many, many pounds of explosive. Los Alamos developed a good understanding of the one-point phenomenon, but would the device operate after it was made safe? Now we'll move into the 1960s and the end of atmospheric testing. About 1960, AEC began disposing of Los Alamos. Before that, everything was owned by the government, and Zia Company, the Crafts concessionaire, was landlord. AEC sold the government-owned properties and invited developers to build spec homes in White Rock. AEC also developed housing lots on Barranca Mesa and sold them for reasonable prices. Immediately after the moratorium, the Soviets went on a testing spree. In about a year, they detonated 80 or so tests, including the 60 megaton monster at Novaya Zemlya in October 1961. In 61, the Soviets had evidently arrived at a similar technology to the U.S. in 1955. Also at this time, the U.S. and USSR began to consider an underground test treaty that would ban tests in atmosphere, space, and underwater. Before the treaty took effect in mid-63, both sides went on a binge of above-ground testing. The 1962 Operation Dominic in the Pacific and the ongoing NTS operations included more than 40 tests that would be banned by the treaty. In Dominic, several high-yield weapons were proved. Exo-atmospheric tests were fired to investigate whether electromagnetic phenomena had military potential. A spectacular surface event was Livermore's NTS Sedan cratering shot. If you haven't seen it, you should sometime. One of my early tests vented radioactivity. Ground Zero movies showed the surface shock, then what looked like a line of dirty gray Old Faithful geysers. The saving grace was that the underground treaty had been signed but had not yet taken effect. The radioactivity leak was unfortunate but legal. Radioactivity escaped into the environment, but not nearly as much as would have had the test been fired above ground. France fired its first nuclear test in 1960 during the U.S. and USSR test moratorium. Britain rejoined the U.S. test program when testing resumed in 1961. Los Alamos and Livermore settled into the routine of step-by-step innovations. Then came MIRV, Multiple Independently Targeted Re-Entry Vehicles. Minuteman became Minute Man when the missile was MIRVed. Every effort was made to reduce warhead size and maximize yield. At the same time, requirements were laid on to improve survivability if attacked by an anti-ballistic missile. The word came down that our next generation primary was not rugged enough to withstand ABM attack and needed to be strengthened. The group leader asked me to get some problems set up to look into the matter. At that time, I was doing vulnerability, lethality, and effects work. I had the problems set up as the discussions indicated, and I also included one that was hell for stout to see how bad it could be. That calculation significantly outperformed everything in its class. The matter was turned over to a very experienced designer. He identified the phenomenon and how to do it on purpose. He showed me a plot in which my off-the-wall guess was teetering on the crest of a narrow performance peak. It is better to be lucky than smart, you know? My calculation was test-fired, and both labs used the technique and stockpile weapons. There were several overseas broken arrows. In January 1966, an alert B-52 was refueling from a tanker aircraft when they collided at high altitude. 7 of the 11 crewmen died. 2 of the 4 weapons fell to the ground. The HE went off and spread plutonium around Palomares, Spain. The other weapons fell into the Mediterranean Sea and were recovered. 1,400 tons of contaminated soil and vegetation were dug up and brought to the U.S. After the accident, some young Palomares men went to nearby villages to seek their brides in fear that local girls were contaminated. 2 years later, a B-52 caught fire and attempted to land at Thule Air Base in Greenland. The aircraft crashed with 4 weapons on board. All crewmen survived except the pilot, who rode the plane down. Under supervision of the Danish government, the U.S. took about 1,000 cubic yards of debris from the site. The idea of alert was that armed bombers were aloft, orbiting, and refueling. If the order came, each would proceed to and strike its assigned targets. After Thule, armed and fueled alert bombers were on the ground with their crews in a nearby ready shack, prepared to fly on a moment's notice. The People's Republic of China conducted its first nuclear test in 1964. By the end of the 60s, the recent U.S. weapon mark numbers were in the 70s. Norris Bradbury retired from the lab in 1969. UC Regents appointed Harold M. Agnew. After suitable notification, AEC withdrew funding from the nuclear rocket and reactor programs, which resulted in a RIF, a reduction in force. As his last act before retirement, Bradbury ordered an across-the-board RIF. The Fission Weapon Design Group RIFed 2 people, even though it was fully funded. Capable people from the defunct K and N divisions were retained and relocated around the laboratory. Bradbury's lab looked after its good people. In contrast, 25 years later in 1994, after suitable notification, DOE withdrew funding for CTR, Controlled Thermonuclear Research Division. 150 CTR people were laid off. For his heroic handling of the CTR RIF, the division leader was given a promotion and the prestigious E.O. Lawrence Award, which was limited by law to recognize only technical achievements. Agnew retained Bradbury's 16 people lab management. A year after Agnew took over, only 2 division leaders were still in place. Agnew had reorganized the lab, and we grunts had hardly noticed. Now we go into this decade of the 70s and the Threshold Test Ban Treaty. During the 1970s, the U.S. introduced a Safeguard anti-ballistic missile system to replace the aging Nike Hercules anti-aircraft and anti-missile missile. 2 Safeguard nuclear interceptors weapons were being deployed. Spartan was a megaton-class system to destroy swarms of incoming Soviet ICBMs outside the atmosphere. The kiloton-class Sprint was to take out leakers that penetrated the Spartan shield. The American people just said no to shooting U.S. nukes over U.S. soil, and Safeguard was canceled. Incidentally, I worked on Sprint lethality, and I can say with authority that only a nuclear explosion can reliably destroy an intercontinental missile. Indeed, the U.S. was able to destroy a malfunctioning spy satellite. It was as big as a school bus and was in a well-determined orbit, I repeat. In 1972, President Nixon made a state visit to the People's Republic of China. It was a glimmer in the gloom of the Cold War. India conducted its first nuclear test in 1974. Also in the 1970s, the U.S. abolished military conscription and went to all volunteer armed forces. I'll come back to that one. Insensitive high explosive was an important innovation of the 1970s. Theodore Benziger, a Los Alamos explosive scientist, found that triamino-trinitrobenzene could be caused to detonate with about 2/3 the energy of the usual explosives. It is so insensitive that it can survive fire, automatic weapon fire, and impact at less than missile reentry speeds. It greatly reduces the chance of plutonium contamination from a Palomares-like accident. Despite its reduced energy, relatively high cost, and difficulty to cause to detonate, it was used by both laboratories in some weapons in the enduring stockpile. In 1975, the Atomic Energy Commission was disestablished because Congress felt there was conflict of interest with AEC developing, inspecting, and licensing nuclear reactors. Nuclear Regulatory Commission was formed to inspect and license reactors, and the rest of AEC was incorporated into ERDA, the Energy Research and Development Administration. In 1977, ERDA was upgraded to cabinet level and renamed DOE, the Department of Energy. In 2000, NNSA, National Nuclear Security Administration, under DOE, was founded to manage the nuclear weapons work. On 1 April 1976, the Threshold Test Ban Treaty took effect. It banned all nuclear tests with yield greater than 150 kilotons. Before that, there was a rash of higher than 150 kiloton tests by both U.S. and USSR. During the 70s decades, several weapons were completed. These included the bombs, B-61, mods, and the B-83, the W-80 cruise missile warhead, and the W-76 and W-78 ballistic missile warheads. To give you an idea of what went on, W-87 was the warhead for a land-based 10 MIRV per missile MX or Peacekeeper ICBM. There was intense competition for the award between the two design labs. Both labs shot nuclear tests during the competitive phase 1. In addition, Midget Man was considered. It was a W-87 single RV missile on a transporter erector launcher that would be driven around a many miles long racetrack to avoid being targeted by Soviet missiles. W-87 was awarded to Livermore, and shortly after that, Midget Man was canceled. The next and last warhead was W-88 for the Navy Trident II submarine launched ballistic missile. The award came to Los Alamos. In 1978, Director Harold Agnew resigned and left the lab. Donald M. Kerr, Jr. was named director by the UC Regents. He had been active in nuclear testing. Under the first three directors, Oppenheimer, Bradbury, and Agnew, management attitude toward the staff was generally that of respect. After that, the attitude changed to indifference and, in one case, contempt. Kerr's regime is known as a time of perpetual reorganizations. Perhaps he was trying to counter the increasing micromanagement from Washington that had so irked Agnew. But it seemed that there were just too many reorganizations, and the number of managers just grew and grew. We called it monopoly management, like the famous board game. You roll the dice and move the tokens. Over the years, American esteem for the nuclear program declined. We considered the 1 year 1979. The accident at 3 Mile Island, Pennsylvania nuclear power plant caused many Americans to become fearful of anything nuclear. A Vela nuclear test detection satellite over the South Atlantic Ocean observed a light signal indicative of a nuclear explosion. A panel of experts opined that it was a natural phenomenon. It was also the last year in which the last order was placed to build a new U.S. nuclear power station. The Karen Silkwood civil suit judgment was another indication that the U.S. nuclear program had lost favor. She was employed at the Kerr-McGee nuclear plant in Oklahoma. Some of the facts were, a routine urinalysis showed far more plutonium than could possibly have come from inside her. She regularly took Quaalude tranquilizers, and she died in a one-car accident on a public highway. The autopsy showed Quaaludes, but no plutonium. The civil suit awarded her heirs $10 million, which was reduced to about $1 million on appeal to pay the lawyers. She got a movie out of that. I will digress a bit. Elsewhere in the world, the U.S. had a large presence in Iran to conduct intelligence on the Soviet Union just over the border. In 1979, Islamic fundamentalists overthrew the Shah's regime and took the U.S. Embassy staff hostage. Ayatollah Khomeini, a Muslim cleric, became the theocratic ruler of Iran. Next door, Saddam Hussein became president of Iraq. In 1980, Iraq attacked Iran. The war lasted 8 years. Iran, with 4 times the land area and 3 times the population, outfought Iraq, but there was no victory or border change. In the last days of 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. The much-feared Red Army did not perform well there. The occupation lasted nearly 10 years. The cost of maintaining the variously 120,000 troops of the 40th Army in Afghanistan helped to bring down the Soviet Union. The Red Army pulled out in 1989 without victory. The U.S. had helped Afghan partisans, the Mujahideen, in their fight against the Soviets. One partisan band evolved into Taliban, and another became Al-Qaeda. Now we'll move into the 1980s, which I'm calling the last decade of testing. It's a long decade, but that's okay. Some of the reasons to justify the worldwide risk of a nuclear test are to investigate new concepts, broaden parameter space, benchmark computer codes, and of course the Admiral's test. Not included as a reason for testing was sales hype in the interlab competition. There were more than a few vanity tests during the 80s. The next weapon after W-88 was Sea Lance, a submarine-launched anti-submarine missile which payloads were a nuclear depth bomb or a lightweight conventional homing torpedo. The weaponization award came to Los Alamos. One nuclear test had been fired when the Navy canceled the nuclear depth bomb. I was program manager for the depth bomb development, and I had described to the associate director for the nuclear test that I thought necessary. He asked, "What if we cannot get them off on your time scale?" And I stammered a bit, and I said, "Well, that might necessitate an additional test." And he laughed, and he said, "So what? We're not shooting anything worthwhile now anyway." As the decade of the 80s went on, fewer and fewer weaponization studies were conducted. One reason was that the nuclear weapons specialty in the U.S. all-volunteer armed forces was recognized as a military career kiss of death. Those specialists were forbidden from serving in Vietnam because they might be captured. Vietnam was where the decorations and promotions were. Just like anyone else, service personnel want to do things that advance their careers, and the nuclear weapons specialty was not one of them. The services had difficulty finding capable people to fill the nuclear weapon jobs. I attended the preparation of a trainer weapon for simulated launch. During the demonstration, I commented that it would be safer if a procedure were done a different way. The major in charge literally shouted me down. Afterward, he apologized, agreed to the procedure change, explained that the performing soldiers were being graded, and my comment might have caused them demerits. With the nuclear weapons specialty, grade C was about as good as it ever got, with F all too easy. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became General Secretary of the Soviet Union. He used terms like glasnost, which means openness, perestroika means restructuring, and he withdrew the Red Army from Afghanistan. These seemed alien from the head of the evil empire. Congress began resisting President Reagan's military buildup because the Soviet threat appeared to be decreasing. The U.S. and USSR fired joint verification experiments. Now there's a waste of a test for you. In 1988, the U.S. fired an underground nuclear test at NTS with Russians present. About a month later, the Soviets fired a test at Semipalatinsk with U.S. experts there. Clamor from anti-nuclear activists grew ever louder. Do we need to continue testing? The labs replied that testing assured that the stockpile would work. The question came back, why do we not shoot weapons from the stockpile? The DoD Joint Chiefs of Staff ordered the labs to take one each of its weapons from the stockpile and shoot it, called a stockpile confidence test. The usual test devices were custom built and fired with field test firing sets. The SCTs were war reserve units that had been deployed. They all worked satisfactorily. Work was ending on the W-87 and W-88 weapons, and little seemed to be coming along. Edward Teller proclaimed the fourth generation of nuclear weapons, SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative. Livermore undertook the X-ray laser, and Los Alamos had two smaller SDI concepts, none of which the American people would stand for. In 1985, Don Kerr resigned, and the Regents appointed director Siegfried S. Hecker, a plutonium metallurgist. In May 1986, the Chernobyl, Ukraine nuclear power plant accident happened, which further increased American dread of anything nuclear. The reactor core melted down and spread radioactivity around Europe. During the 1980s, all but one of the longtime contractors of the production plants refused to renew their contracts with DOE. The Rocky Flats plant was closed in 1989, ostensibly for environmental problems, but also due to protests from the people of Denver, who felt that the risk of plutonium manufacturing upwind of their city was no longer justified by the Soviet threat. For all intents and purposes, when Rocky Flats closed, then so did the entire U.S. nuclear weapon manufactory. The Rocky Flats mission, the manufacture of plutonium pits, came to Los Alamos. When that had problems, pit reuse came along, which was to configure a new device around an old retired pit. And this is silly because a pit has a limited life and must be remanufactured sooner or later. Several tests during the decade included reused pits. Also in 1989, the Savannah River tritium production reactors were shut down as too unsafe for further use. In 1999, almost a tritium half-life later, DOE acquired a TVA, surplus civilian reactor, reconfigured it, and relicensed it to produce tritium, but not more plutonium. In 1991, President Bush and Secretary Gorbachev agreed to mutually retire tactical, that is, battlefield nuclear forces. DoD STRATCOM, Strategic Command, was organized and took custody of all remaining U.S. nuclear weapons. The enduring stockpile types include 2 submarine-launched ballistic missiles, 2 land-based intercontinental ballistic missiles, 2 aerial bombs, and a warhead deployed on several cruise missile types. Of the 7 weapon types, 1 bomb and 1 ICBM warhead were developed at Livermore and the others at Los Alamos. All were conceived during the Cold War. Are they appropriate for the world we live in now? No one in our government seems to know or care. As recently as mid-1980s, there had been about 35 nuclear weapon types deployed. The U.S. Army and Surface Navy no longer have any nuclear weapons. During the '91 Gulf War, there were 6 U.S. nuclear weapon-armed aircraft carriers prowling the waters off Iraq. For the '03 Gulf War, there were aircraft carriers, but they were not nuclear weapon-armed. In the '91 Gulf War, precision-guided munitions, that's smart bombs, had done well. Who needs nukes? The Berlin Wall came down in November 1989, signaling the disintegration of the Soviet Union. Each of the communist bloc nations and the 15 Soviet Socialist republics became independent. Romania executed its former dictator and his wife. Czechoslovakia split into the Czech Republic and Slovakia. But mostly the new republics just sent the Russians away. Germany reunified and made Berlin its capital again. All Soviet nuclear weapons were taken by Russia. None of the other republics wanted any of them. The big problem was that their economies were in ruins. However, Russia seems to be recovering. Now we'll briefly talk after the Cold War. There was a time lag before it was realized that the demise of the USSR also ended the Cold War. And the cessation, Director Hecker had to realign the lab to account for the end of the Cold War and the cessation of testing. He focused the lab, which had been strongly experimental, toward computation, virtual reality. The multi-lab ASCII, Advanced Strategic Computing Initiative, was aimed at building the world's greatest computers and used them with newly conceived nuclear weapon simulation codes. Evidently, the idea is that if one throws enough money at computation, then accurate results will happen. An alternate vision was that the Los Alamos lab could have become the National Experimental Park, rather than try to compete with Silicon Valley. After the Cold War, Congress drastically reduced the DOE weapon funding, primarily for the NTS and the production plants, which had large layoffs. DOE reorganized the production complex by reducing the 7 plants to 4, with some manufacturing at Los Alamos and Sandia Labs. Old-timers with the skills necessary for weapon development or manufacturing were nearing retirement age, and many did just that. To add to the distress, Environmental Protection Agency exemptions for the nuclear weapon program were rescinded. Familiar chemicals were banned and new processes had to be invented. A great deal of funds were spent for site restoration. There was concern whether weapons made with the new processes would work, and this was without nuclear testing. Just like everyone else, DOE had to write environmental impact statement, EISs, for new construction. Los Alamos was building a new radiographic facility and had to stop work until the EIS was prepared. The lab took it to federal court and lost. When your industry develops products that contain radioactive materials in association with explosives, the dreaded words are mixed waste. And of course, after September 11th, the cost of security just drastically increased. President Clinton sponsored the CTBT, the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, which went into effect in mid-1996. Russia ceased testing in 1990. U.S., UK stopped in 92. France and China tested until the treaty took effect in 96. The U.S. Senate has not ratified the CTBT, but all major world powers accepted it, except India and Pakistan, which conducted nuclear tests in 98. The so far last nuclear test was that by North Korea in 06. Hecker served until 97, when John C. Brown was appointed director by the Regents. He was a particle physicist who had worked with the 800 MeV accelerator. He advocated accelerator production of tritium, which was rejected in favor of reactor production. Around the turn of the millennium, the lab came under severe criticism from certain members of Congress. Brown resigned in January of 03, and UC president named acting director George Peter Nanos, Jr., Vice Admiral, U.S. Navy, retired. The Regents confirmed his appointment in May of 03. On Trinity anniversary, 16 July 2004, Nanos shut down the laboratory for safety and security lapses. People were required to come in but not work. When the security breach was found to be a mistake, Nanos did not restart the lab. Parts of the lab were idle for 6 months. In May 05, exactly 2 years after the Regents confirmed him, he was removed. Robert Kuck from Livermore was made acting director. There was an open competition for the Los Alamos management contract, which had been rolled over to the University of California since the 1940s. A new contract was awarded to a consortium that included University of California. With the new regime, Michael Anastasio became director in June of 06, and a horizontal transfer from director at Livermore, and I thank you very much.
Any questions for John?
They're probably classified.
I have one.
Let me get the microphone.
The Thin Man, the way in which they found out that the Thin Man wouldn't work, was that based on theoretical or actual testing?
No, it was, they had the data on the plutoniums. The question was, how did they know that Thin Man would not work? And the answer was that they had the plutonium from Oak Ridge, and it had too many neutrons for the procedure they were going to use. And so, what do you call that? Theoretical? Yes. And so they knew that it wouldn't make any significant yield. Oh,
you were talking about different spies and naming some different people. There was one person that you didn't name, but if somebody Googles John Richter, Los Alamos, you'll see his name come up very frequently in association with you, and that's Win Ho Lee. Could you talk a little bit about the Win Ho Lee case and what your opinion is?
I first got involved with the Wen Ho Lee case in 1995. A bunch of us were summoned to DOE headquarters to read some blue border material on China. The question was, what does China know about our nuclear weapons? So I'd read all this stuff, And blue border means that I had to travel to Washington to read it because it couldn't come here. And the stuff is so sensitive that it would probably disclose who had leaked it in China. So anyway, back and forth and back and forth. And there were some indications like the dimensions of the W-88 warhead that came through. Now that's pretty definitive. And, you know, but over the years, the idea dawned on us that, you know, we had to, Los Alamos had to publish an interface, an ICD, interface control document, so that, Lockheed Sunnyvale could build a reentry vehicle for it. And these were the dimensions of the thing, stay out zones and so forth. And we finally dawned on us that that's all they knew. And I had never seen the ICD. I'm sure that Wen-Ho Lee never saw the ICD, but somehow or other somebody, there were 450 copies out there. And so anyway, we were bumping along, and they disclosed that Wen-Ho Lee was very unpopular around the lab. I barely knew him. We could say hi to each other is about all. But anyway, Charlie Neal of our organization was going through some of the files, suspect files of Wen-Ho Lee, and he came across one and he asked me about it. What's that? And I said, and I looked at the dimensions and the layout of the materials and so forth, and I said, that's 88. And what had happened is he had been downloading his classified files on an unclassified computer so that they were vulnerable to being accessed by outsiders. Now this he did, that's for sure, because they were there. There was no evidence that anybody accessed them. And so they fired him from the lab, and then in late '99 they arrested him, and then they were going to put him, they put him in jail with chains, and they kept him incarcerated at the Santa Fe detention center, and they'd drive him down to federal court in Albuquerque in chains. He was forbidden on the visits from his wife and talking Chinese because they didn't understand Chinese, and so forth. And so a friend of mine at Los Alamos asked me, John, what do you know about this case? And I said, well, I've been around. I've been reading the Chinese intel and so forth. And I was the group leader when the primary of the W-88 primary was developed. I didn't do it, but the guy that did worked for me. And so he says, what do you think about the case? I says, it stinks. So anyway, he talked around, and I was called up to testify for the defense at a Wen-Ho Lee bail hearing in August of 2000. God, it was the toughest 2.5 hours of my life. Anyway, they sat me down, and what do you think? And so I says, look, the best thing that happened to the United States is if China got the W-88 and tried to build it. That would really stop them cold, because, you know, it would really shut down their industry. And there were some other things. I'd read the time between when they were supposed to be shooting it and when Wen-Ho Lee was not long enough. There was another Chinese that did turn over classified information to Red China. His nickname was Tiger Trap, and he worked in the early 80s. And there was plenty of time for the stuff that he turned over. And they never got indictable goods on him, but it's pretty clear that he did. So anyway, I was down there on the federal court, and all of my friends that were let in on this classified session were growling at me, frowning at me. It was bad. And so finally the judge says, John, why would anybody download classified information on an unclassified computer? And I says, well, a lot of the application programmers at Los Alamos doing unclassified work just stayed home and did their work via the internet. And maybe Wen Ho Lee decided he wanted to do it that way too without considering that it was illegal. He says, John, why would anybody download their files on portable media like, floppy disks? And I says, maybe he's backing up his files. John, why would anybody do such a thing? And I says, well, remember the old maxim, never attribute to malice what can be adequately explained by stupidity. And what he did was stupid. And he settled the case. Is that enough?
Yes.
And I probably lost my clearance in '06 for that.
How effective do you think the RRW program is technically and in our ability to maintain our deterrent capabilities?
Look, we fired over 1,000 nuclear tests. You can have any of them to build and stockpile. And why do anything different, I don't know. We have a weapon in stockpile that, in my opinion, is very rugged and reliable. And we could just replicate that more times. That's my feeling of the thing. To go off and build a big boondoggle event it's likely not to get funded anyway, so I don't have to object to it. Anybody else?
Any other questions? I think, Margaret, you wanted to come up and say something?
Oh, good.
Wonderful. On behalf of everyone here in DNDO, I'd like to give a small token of our appreciation for you giving our talk tonight, and thank you very much.
Sure enough.
Well, that's it for this evening. Bus will pick you up at 7:30 in the morning back at the Hampton.